So we're going to go ahead and start the meeting. While we do introductions around the table, we'll start off with Mr. Paul Avila.
Testing. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Paul Avila, Paul Avila Associates, and happy Valentine's Day.
Rita Lou, Fratic International.
Levon Daniel, Danco.
Bill Lamar, California Small Business Alliance.
David Rothbart, the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
John DeWitt, J.E. DeWitt Incorporated, COG.
Jeff Blake, Metal Finishers Association.
Nancy Feldman, Legal.
Derek Alatorre, South Coast AQMD.
Baby and Weston, South Coast.
Joe Impoletti, South Coast AQMD.
Lisa Mirasola, South Coast AQMD.
Todd Campbell, Clean Energy.
Rachel Arizmendi, City of Sierra Madre, and strangely my title has never changed from this meeting, so now I am Mayor Pro Tem again.
All right, there you go. Okay, we'll make that change next meeting. Okay, with that, Mayor Benoit, do we have you yet, or I don't think we can hear you. Nope. Okay, so I'll move. I'll start the agenda. Approval of the minutes from January 17th. Can I get a motion? Or first of all, any questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I was bewildered when you made the comment, and when I looked at it today in admin committee, I thought I got to just ask this. On the last page under item number 2, I was commenting on the look back or retrospective analysis that has never been on page 3 of the minutes of our last meeting, and the last sentence says, Mr. Lamar further requested a discussion on a look-back analysis on some rules. And then it says, Mr. Alatorre reiterated that we are in severe non-attainment, and the last thing we want is to be mandated by federal government. I have no idea what you mean.
So I don't know why.
I wasn't even talking about
those are two different items.
Okay.
And I think it just wasn't separated. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and separate those two items to make it two different, I guess, paragraphs. So I think what I recall is I agreed I would go to staff and see if there's any studies that show what you asked for, which was I think it was you and Mr. DeWitt, I believe, but it was looking at the rules that were implemented and seeing the cost effectiveness of it.
Yeah, I raised this issue going all the way back to when Norma Glover was the chair.
Supervisor Perez, can you hear me?
We got you now.
Yeah, we had some technical difficulties, but we're on now.
Okay, can you guys hear us in the room now?
Yes.
Hey, great. Okay. And we're working now, it sounds like. Great. Please continue.
I raised this issue all the way back when Norma Glover was the board chair, and if you recall, in looking at the I'm trying to think of what the there was a study. Yeah, there was a study that was done a few years ago where the district brought in a contractor from, I think it was Maryland, to do was it a, Jill, do you remember that? Yeah, you remember I and a number of other people were interviewed, and I can't remember the name. It's like an acronym or something that they have, but it was mentioned in there. I brought that up again, and they took note of it. So if you could and schedule it for another meeting or other meetings, and I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Will do. Any other issues with the minutes? you got to speak in the mic so they can hear you on the other end.
I make a motion that we accept the minutes as corrected.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Or do we have to do, we're teleconference, aren't we? Oh, any opposed? So moved.
I abstain. I wasn't here.
Okay, we have one abstention. All right, Derek, follow-up on action items?
Thank you, Mayor Benoit. There's one action item. This came with our LGSBA goals and objectives, item number 12. Staff coordinating with Mr. Rothbard and no revisions to the document were made. As number 18 addressed Mr. Rothbard's request regarding discussion on the list of AB 2588 compounds issued by CARB and OEHA.
Those comments were addressed.
Say that again.
That we went back and forth and had the language clarified, so that's been addressed.
Yeah. That's it.
All right. Unless there's any other items on that, we'll move on to the first discussion item, the information on available clean air vehicles. Lisa.
Good morning, Lisa Mirasola. I hope you can all hear me fine. Just speak up if you need me to adjust my volume. Thank you for inviting us to discuss with you the available clean air vehicles. And we're going to broaden it a little bit to talk about near and zero emission vehicles and the infrastructure as well. So, by way of background, our technology demonstration program provides funding to develop, research, develop, demonstrate, and accelerate the deployment of cleaner technologies. And we leverage our funding with state and federal and private funding sources. On average, we shoot for 1 to 4 leveraging, but lately we've been getting a lot of large projects going. So our leveraging in the last year or two has been we're heavily leveraged, so getting a lot of big projects going for relatively less local investment. So to really focus in on the available clean air vehicles, I wanted to just kind of give you an update about what's in our fleet currently for demonstration. So while the majority of AQMD's fleet is still natural gas, the Honda Civic natural gas vehicle dedicated has not been produced since 2015. So we're continuing to demonstrate vehicles and evaluate them so that we can add them to our general AQMD fleet. We use these demonstration vehicles for education and outreach. We get feedback from our staff drivers. And now in our fleet, we're starting to make that transition to adding plug-in hybrid vehicles into our fleet. So for our regular fleet, we use regular district funds and we purchase in larger quantities. And for our demonstrations, we usually purchase 1 or 2, maybe 3 vehicles at a time so that we can learn the vehicles and evaluate them. And we tend to lease the vehicles so that we can continually have new vehicles to demonstrate. So in our fleet, right now, we have, in our demonstration fleet, we have a couple of plug-in hybrids. Some of the older vehicles, a lot of the leases went back to the manufacturer. Some of the plug-in hybrids that we purchased did go into our regular fleet. But currently for demonstration, we have a couple of plug-in hybrids from Chevy and Honda. So those use both, they can fuel with both gasoline and by plugging in. And the range on those vehicles will vary now. The newer vehicles get longer range plugging in. So whereas the initial plug-in hybrids were maybe going 10 to 30 miles on electric and then the rest gasoline, you're seeing those batteries get larger. So now the plug-in hybrids are getting somewhere between 25 and 50 miles for the new ones coming out. But you're seeing product turnover. So this is the last year that Chevy, actually 2019 was the last year that Chevy produced the plug-in hybrid Volt. The Honda Clarity plug-in hybrid is actually one of 3 Clarity versions. So there's different drive systems on the same body. So the Clarity is available as a plug-in hybrid, a battery electric, or a fuel cell vehicle. So in our fleet, we have both the plug-in hybrid version and a fuel cell version. So it makes some interesting comparisons. You can see how the components, there's similarities amongst the vehicles, but also the vehicles are each designed differently, so it's interesting to compare. The battery electrics we have are Chevy Bolt EV, and we just added a couple of the Hyundai Kona EVs. So those are the newest addition to our fleet. And we're continually turning those over and evaluating new options. And we have a variety of fuel cell vehicles. We do have one older Toyota Mirai fuel cell vehicle that now has about 50,000 miles on it, and we're continuing to use that in our fleet and accumulate mileage and see how that does over time. The warranties on all these major automaker products are usually at least 8 years, and the plug-in hybrids in particular now have 15-year, 150,000-mile warranties that are required to be certified by California in order to get all of the incentives. Now, you can get plug-in hybrids that don't have those long warranties, or maybe they don't have the CARB certification. So just because it plugs in doesn't mean it also has a clean engine. And I see a question over there.
Yes, my question is, what is the criteria for when you choose a vehicle for plug-in hybrid, battery electric, or fuel cell? Do you have a set of standards that they have to reach before you consider them?
We're looking to advance the technology over time. So each year we're looking at what are the new ones available, which ones get the most range. So in a plug-in hybrid, we did start out with a couple of plug-in hybrids that had 10-mile range. But when those leases were done, we went to the next, so 30 to 40 miles. The Honda Clarity plug-in hybrid is 47 miles electric range. And then basically we're trying to cover 4 counties with our fleet. So even though our goal is to get to zero emission, we've been seeing the ranges on the battery electric and more fueling infrastructure for the fuel cell vehicles, but those plug-in hybrids are a great transition. So each entity, each fleet is going to have different ways to evaluate what fits their needs, as well as each individual.
Okay. Thank you.
Another question?
Lisa, this is more of a generic question. As far as a warranty, AQM or the buyers, they don't have to buy a warranty, correct? You can just buy the car retail right off the lot. But it's chosen to buy a warranty in the event of malfunction of some type. Is that correct?
Well, the state of California requires an emission control warranty.
Oh my.
So it's actually much more stringent than the federal requirements in order to get all of the state incentives.
Right.
So I'm going to talk about the incentives a little bit later. There are additional warranties you can purchase when you go to a dealership.
Right.
So those are optional. They may be for different purposes. There's also varying types of warranties on each vehicle. There's going to be basically a warranty on the vehicle as a whole.
Correct.
That may be short. And then there may be some intermediate warranty. But for the plug-in hybrids to get all the incentives, that's where they really want to take full advantage of those emission reductions, and that's when they require the 15-year warranty to get all the incentives.
Right.
So it's a good thing to look at, is look at what's your warranties, because there may be more than one warranty, and it's for specific items.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. So basically over time, this is mix of these vehicles that we demonstrate is going to vary. Some of them are assigned to drivers. Others are available for events or backup in case we need to do service. We'll occasionally swap out vehicles. And so over time, we look and see what are the potential additions for this year and going forward. So these are just a few of the ones out there. Some of the ones that are kind of the highest potential. But sometimes we get surprised and something will come out and it catches our attention really quickly. So this is going to vary over time. And again, for demonstration, we're only getting these in 1 to 2 quantities, mostly to try them and demonstrate them and learn about them. So we're looking at getting more Clarity plug-in hybrids for demonstration. Again, mostly because we have to cover 4 counties. And another one coming out is expected to be the Ford Escape plug-in hybrid. A couple of battery electrics. The Ford Mach-E was shown at the LA Auto Show, is getting a lot of attention, and VW as well. Pretty much every automaker is coming out with some version of plug-in or battery electric vehicle. Because there are currently 4 automakers that recognize CARB's authority to regulate tailpipe emissions. And so we're prioritizing those, and those are from Ford, Honda, BMW, and Volkswagen. So in a sense, it may limit our acquisition a little bit, but all those manufacturers are coming out with great new models. And so over time, you're going to see the number of models being available is going to increase over time. Cheaper batteries are allowing more automakers to provide more electric drive vehicle options. And the number of fuel cell vehicle models is expected to grow as well. So that's that bright blue that's at the top of the bars that's just starting to grow. Because we've been supporting the hydrogen infrastructure, we have so far had all the fuel cell models available in our region. And just to describe a little bit on the other big excitement is we're seeing now announcements of light-duty battery electric trucks. So some new kind of startups getting attention, a company called Rivian and another Tesla. You may have seen some of their announcements, as well as the established automakers, Ford on the left and Hummer on the right, and some other additional ones, newcomers. There's a Bollinger and another plug-in hybrid from Lordstown, potentially. So the growth and the proliferation of the types of vehicles available will help get more people into those near and zero-emission tailpipe vehicles. So just to cover some of the incentives, so there are federal tax credits available, but they vary by manufacturer. And it's up to 300,000 vehicles per manufacturer, so some of them are phasing out, from Tesla and General Motors first, but others will also phase out. So it's helpful. But some of the manufacturers actually first to market, they may not have incentives anymore. Another incentive that's available is access to carpool lanes. The program was changed, and so the stickers are now only valid for 3 years from when they're issued. It's actually maybe three and a little bit more. So it used to be when they issued the sticker, it was for the life of the vehicle, but they ended that program. And now this new program, basically the red stickers were issued in 2017 and they expire in January 1st, 2022. The purple stickers were issued last year and they expire January 1st, 2023. And the orange stickers are the ones that are being issued now, and they will expire January 1st, 2024. The whole program is set to expire January 1st, 2025. In the past, we've seen some legislator will step up about 2 years ahead and start the ball rolling and figure out what they want to do. So there's a trade-off between the number of vehicles allowed in the carpool lanes and trying to mitigate the congestion that may cause, because the carpool lanes were trying to help keep that efficient 45-mile-an-hour speed limit in the carpool lane. There's also additional incentives if you qualify based on income and also your family size. So Replace Your Ride, AQMD administers that program. I do have some handouts on the side if you're more interested in some of the details, but you can get up to $9,500 when you replace your vehicle. Now that's different than the statewide program that's called Clean Vehicle Rebate. And for that program, you don't have to replace your vehicle. So that's good for people who have never had a vehicle. But this year what's new is for the CVRP is they no longer provide incentives for vehicles that have a base MSRP of $60,000 or more. So, which in a way makes sense, but I used to do one list that would cover both of those, both categories of carpool stickers and incentives, and it's getting more difficult. So I have last year's 2019 list of vehicles, but if you take one of those, just keep in mind that some of those, for example, the Tesla Model S and Model X would no longer qualify for the statewide cash rebates. They still can get carpool stickers. There's also funding from the state for charging and hydrogen infrastructure, which I'll talk a little bit about in a bit. And you should check with your local utilities, see if they have lower rates or other incentives in their area. So any question on incentives, Mike? Yes?
I thought under the Bloom legislation, even though it's 3 years, that there was a possibility for extension of.
Not of the individual sticker that I know of.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The CHP keys in on those colors.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that's why they're rotating the colors every year now.
I just wonder if you're starting to see an increase in leases then instead of actual purchases.
Haven't been tracking that, but that's what we're doing in our fleet.
Yeah. Okay.
So there was a period of time where I was using demonstration funds to buy vehicles more because they were capped at the number of stickers issued, and we wanted to keep those stickers.
Right.
But now, for the last couple years now, since 2017, I've only been leasing.
Yeah.
So until we figure out what's going to go on after 2025, I probably will focus more on leasing than on purchasing. But our regular fleet, they only purchase. So they're looking for low bids. Yes.
Since it's been what 6-year window more or less when the first car came out with the hybrids, more or less, maybe 7 years or a little longer. Does AQMD keep a track on that? For example, measuring them. And what I'm really trying to get at is, what would happen? What happens to the used vehicles? Do they get resold on the retail market? And is there a way of tracking them once they've left, let's say, a 5-year, not the depreciation side, but a 5-year measuring side, for lack of better terms?
Yeah, we're not. We're monitoring it more. I wouldn't say we're measuring it. So there are more vehicles coming off lease now. So you're starting to see them in the used market. And that's one of the things about our Replace Your Ride program. So if you're low income or with a large family, you actually can get incentive to replace your used vehicle with a newer used vehicle. So, but it has to be, I think it's 6 years. The used vehicle that you replace your car with can only be 6 years old or newer. So I think that's now 2014 or newer. And each year that goes up. So it's the newer used cars you can replace it. So there's that delta difference in emissions from an old used car to a newer used one. And that's what we're getting that fleet turnover. Did that answer your question?
It did, almost.
Okay.
Almost, but that's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
Because I know there's a big market for that with all these cars coming off leases. Does the tax incentive still stay the same, or they just depreciate as the years go along? Do you know that?
Yeah, the federal tax credit is only for the first purchase.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And another question?
Yes, are you the point person on the prospective purchase of a car that may qualify for a rebate?
There's different staff that handles different parts of the incentive programs.
So
So I
you
mostly
just call
focus on
up here and somebody will refer.
you might get referred. I focus mostly on the technology that's coming and evaluating what to add to our demonstration.
I'm looking for more money back than it cost me for the car yet, so, you know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Paul stole part of my question here, a good part of it. I just did a Google search on electric cars, and it says to date, 570,000 electric cars have been sold in California since 2011. So that's 8 to 9 years, and that it really isn't. You know, that's around 60, a little over 60,000 cars a year compared to IC engine cars. But I guess my question, to piggyback off of Paul's, is what is the secondary market for electric vehicles or all of these different types of electric vehicles, whether they're plug-in or hybrid or whatever they are. Typically, you'll see that the cost of a new car is arguably way out of reach for many of the people in the, let's say, AB 617 communities, working class families or working class people. And I think that, if your objective and the state's objective is to lower pollution from mobile sources, I think there should be some, you ought to have some sort of a story or some facts as to what the secondary market is, what are the trade-in values, are there any incentives, and apparently there aren't, or warranties? Is there an ideal mileage when an owner of a new car should consider trading it in on either another car and things like that?
Yeah, there's different cost calculators out there that can help with that. But that's for any kind of used car. There's comparison calculators.
But I would think that should be part of your pitch, and I don't just mean South Coast. I mean California in general. Regulatory agencies that are trying to push conversion away from IC engines and fossil fuels.
And I do recall there being legislation proposed to provide more incentives for used vehicles, but I think what resulted was that Replace Your Ride program that for low income can give you an incentive for a new car or for a newer used car. So they're kind of slicing that. And maybe in the future there'll be additional incentives.
Yeah, but I mean, even a monetary incentive is one thing. What about maintenance and repairs? When do you have to look? Is it over 100,000 miles, 200,000 miles? What is the availability of mechanical help for these types of vehicles?
Why don't we let Naveen? Naveen has some answers to your questions.
So Bill, hi, Naveen Berry with Technology Advancement Office as well. Just wanted to give some feedback on the AB 617 communities that you mentioned. Staff did some pretty extensive outreach to each one of the communities, probably multiple times, on the availability of programs like Replace Your Ride. And, as you did a Google search, some of those vehicles are available for $9,500 or less. So for those low-income residents that qualify, it actually covers the full cost of the car. A lot of the used Leafs are well under $10,000 now, and you can get those fairly readily available. As the market, and you quoted, a little bit more than 500,000 that have been sold in California, as that market is growing, the aftermarket support, non-dealer repair technicians, and those facilities are also growing. So we keep track of those through our Replace Your Ride program, but we can see if we can dig out some data for you as to when and how much mileage they had, when they turned over. I'll have to see what level of detail is in our database, but those support networks are growing, and it's really a market-driven approach, not just from our Replace Your Ride program.
Yeah, no, and I would appreciate some more information, but my thoughts were more towards the buying public. Certainly if I have questions, somebody else might have similar, in Bellflower or something like this, or Maywood or Bell Gardens might have, the same questions. Should I do this? Am I really getting a bargain? Am I just doing this for clean air, or is this going to last my family for 10 years or 7 years or whatever it is?
Two of the biggest reasons we hear in our Replace Your Ride program is carpool lane sticker. But as Lisa mentioned, those tend to expire after a certain period of time based on the latest ARB approach. And then the second big reason is fuel cost savings. and that continues to be maintained over the life of those vehicles, either it's a battery electric or a plug-in hybrid. So those are two main reasons why people switch. As far as a warranty goes, and Lisa can correct me, but anything that has a auxiliary or a hybrid battery or a full battery, I believe has a 7-year, 150,000 mile warranty from required by ARB, as opposed to 36,000 or 50,000 miles for traditional internal combustion engines. So there is a protection in the system for those higher cost components such as battery packs.
Quick question, Lisa, on the
one more.
carpool stickers.
Uh-huh.
So since now those are expiring, is that for when people purchase a new vehicle? So after the 3 years, they're no longer eligible? And how does it work for people that are purchasing used vehicles?
I believe there was a component of this legislation. I don't think it's been enacted yet. So, well, maybe it actually has. So if the vehicle, even though it's purchased new, if they did not get a carpool sticker, it would still qualify for a sticker for the second owner. But once it's issued a sticker, the sticker is only good for 3 years. And I don't know, I think there might have been another provision. I think if you were low income, again, there was a certain income qualification, you could get another sticker. But that's really more of a DMV. They're the ones that would have to screen that, and I don't know if DMV has implemented that part of the legislation yet. Okay, so in order to support all these new vehicles with fueling, we added chargers here at AQMD. So we added level 2 charging up in the parking lot for both guests and employees. And the hardware is a local provider, Broadcom Telecommunications. It's using a Green Lots network. And we started cost recovery. So basically charging 6 cents per kilowatt hour for the first 5 hours, and then it goes to 16 cents per kilowatt hour after that to both support the need for charging, but trying to get that turnover so we use the infrastructure efficiently. We're also an example of kind of supporting Rule 2202 for large workplaces for ride sharing. That's one of the options to get back into compliance. If you need to comply with Rule 2202 is by adding some public charging. We also have an incentive for residential charging. So for $250 or up to $500 if you have a low income. There's also an incentive under the Replace Your Ride program. Depending on your income, you may qualify for additional incentive on the infrastructure side to help with the labor cost. If you have the cost of installing the chargers is going to vary. And on the hydrogen side, we've got about 20 hydrogen stations in our 4-county region. There have been now 44 that were publicly co-funded by the California Energy Commission under their AB 118 funds. And so those are primarily, the focus was for supporting passenger vehicles. But we're also demonstrating a lot of new heavy-duty fuel cell buses and trucks. And so on the bottom right, we just had a new station opened up. Can we let him know his mic is on? Your mic is on, I guess. Okay. And so at the Orange County Transit Authority, there's the currently largest liquid hydrogen delivered hydrogen station, along with 10 fuel cell New Flyer buses. So we now have another transit agency in addition to Sunline that has fuel cell buses in their fleet. New fueling protocols for higher flow rates, faster fueling, so that they can integrate these buses in with their natural gas buses. And OCTA is also going to be adding electric buses next year. On the left side, you'll see a progression of trucks. The green zero-emission container truck on the top left started out with DOE funding and demonstrated fuel cell drayage truck, and it's been fueling with mobile fueler, but we're working on building those heavy-duty hydrogen fueling stations. And so then you're seeing additional development of fuel cell trucks for demonstration. Toyota put 2 Mirai fuel cell stacks in the red truck, and then they made a blue Beta truck on the bottom left, and then the one on the far left bottom corner is the latest version that with additional CARB funding and funding from AQMD, we're going to be deploying 10 Kenworth fuel cell trucks. So working on building the stations and developing the trucks together. So any questions on this map? Okay, yes.
How does this sync up with CARB's very ambitious electrification rules?
So, for example, the buses are now making plans to transition to zero-emission buses, and many of them are adding battery electric buses, but for the larger fleets especially, they're looking at the hydrogen fuel cell as well. So the station development is supporting some of that rollout. But there's also a lot of private investment that needs to go with this. So these are co-funded, not entirely publicly funded.
Thank you. But in terms of all of these upgrades with natural gas and hydrogen and other alternative sources of energy, there's a big electrification push.
Yes.
Are they going to make all of this money that's already invested in alternative sources of energy? Do you see, and maybe you don't, and maybe it's too far down the road, but because there's a big push for electrification. So will it all be electric at one point? And then what about all the money invested in these alternative sources?
Yeah, we take a portfolio approach. We try not to predict the market too strongly. And we still see a role, especially for hydrogen, in medium and heavy duty trucks and other applications, as well as in storage. Seasonal and large storage, just similar to the way we store natural gas. There may be some synergies there. So it's early to tell, and right now, both state and local entities, we're investing in both in different ways. So
also, well, we do support, we try to be technology agnostic, and so we support both technologies, both electric and hydrogen fuel cell. And a lot of it depends on the transit authority on which they choose. Some are going the electric path and some are going to hydrogen, like OCTA. They're actually looking at both. We just deployed 10 fuel cell buses there and a fuel cell hydrogen station in Santa Ana at one of their facilities. But they're also have ordered some electric buses. So they want to look at both technologies to see which ones fit their particular duty cycles before they decide which path to go down. And other transit authorities like Foothill Transit, they initially went the electric route, and they're looking at that quick charge electric bus that we helped fund some of that. And just found out through that experience that really they're now looking at hydrogen. So, you know, it all depends on how it works in their particular situation. And there's advantages to both.
Yes, go ahead.
Just a relatively easy question. What's your name, young man?
I'm Joe.
Joe.
Impoletti.
Okay,
Yeah.
Joe. Give me a ballpark of what a hydrogen bus costs right off the shelf with built-in hydrogen transformers,
Right.
more
Yeah.
or less.
Well, they're not real cheap. Unfortunately, they're more expensive than battery electric.
Yeah.
And a project that we're proposing right now, New Flyer gave us a price of $1.1 million per bus.
Wow.
And they are working on, Ballard is working on a new fuel cell system, which we're going to also demonstrate in this particular project. And they believe that that one will be the first bus below 1 million. So that's a big, and we're talking about maybe about 800,000. So that's huge. Electrics are a bit less, and that's because the cost of batteries have fallen precipitously of recent, which is really good for both the heavy-duty truckers that are also developing electric trucks, as well as the buses. So,
I just have to say though, when we developed the California Resources Board's first transit bus roll that moved away from diesel, Ballard promised that the buses would be down to 500,000 in 2008. So.
And again, Naveen Berry is really dependent on volumes and scale, right? So as Joe and Lisa explained, the transit authorities are going different pathways. They're testing them all out. One of the analyses that we're currently doing and will continue to do is on larger volumes, even if the buses may be a little bit more for fuel cells, which we think there's a crossover point in larger volumes, the infrastructure costs associated with charging buses with DC fast chargers versus fueling, let's say the Orange County Transit Authority example that Lisa gave, can fuel up to 50 buses using the same $5 million investment. But if you had to fuel or charge 50 electric buses, that cost may be very different. The amount of energy that needs to be brought on site for transformers or supply upgrades may be very different. So we're looking at volumes from both perspective, and these are some of the early stage rollouts. As we get a better handle on pricing and volume and scale, I think we'll be able to better address in more detail your questions.
Naveen, just to give some perspective, LA County is doing a pretty progressive plan to switch over from natural gas to electric, and their preliminary estimates in the operations plan is they're going to have to spend $100 million for charging infrastructure per division, and they have 12 divisions where they're planning to do this. So you do the math, that's $1.2 billion. Of course, this is a forecast. It's something that hasn't been built before, and that's not even talking about the upstream power that needs to be delivered to each division, what has to be spent on the utility side for ratepayer money, and of course you haven't bought the buses yet. So
I appreciate it, Todd. We work pretty closely with all the transits as well, and certainly that's a big part of their concern and why they're looking at alternatives as well. Range and weight limitations on the buses is another area they continue to look at for battery electric compared to fuel cells. So yeah, there's a lot of uncertainties out there, and I think perhaps that's why ARB has a fairly long-term rollout schedule as well. And right now, they've asked the transit authority to submit a plan on what pathways and what those costs will be. But infrastructure is certainly the biggest uncertainty, and we've seen those costs as well.
Yeah, another thing that we're also investigating to support electric vehicle infrastructure as well as hydrogen are microgrids. And we just had a meeting yesterday with a company that specializes in microgrids, and with the on-site generation, which a microgrid is generating power on-site using solar or fuel cell, and then have battery storage, and also have a management system that interfaces with the charging of the vehicles.
All right, so a lot of good projects coming up, and some additional funding coming from the California Energy Commission for building additional hydrogen fueling stations. So this is a couple years worth of funding in the solicitation. for newer upgraded retail hydrogen stations, requiring 50% match, which could include local funds. So it's possible AQMD will help with that effort as well. They get additional credit for under LCFS if they provide 40% renewable. The minimum is 33% now. And so they're in the process now of going through this solicitation. Hopefully, most of the AQMD region is covered either as upgrade or new markets. So you see the different colors on there. As long as you're the gray areas, they're not providing funding yet, but they're really focusing on the retail markets where the automakers are most interested in growing the markets for fuel cell vehicles. And as long as other vehicles don't interfere with fueling the light-duty vehicles, there is the possibility to also encourage other commercial vehicle and bus fleet usage. So an example of that would be at UC Irvine, where they do actually manage the use of this station. We're helping to expand that station to serve more light-duty vehicles and also fuel their campus bus at night. So that also is kind of a backup to the new Orange County Transit Authority station. If for some reason they have problem with their new station, they can also still fuel at a nearby station. So that network building is really an important part of this process of evaluating where the next stations will get built. And we also, because most of our NOx reductions are coming from the medium and heavy duty truck side, we have a lot of new projects with major developers, with Daimler for battery electric trucks, building Class 8 and Class 6 trucks with infrastructure and storage systems, and also providing outreach and demonstration through fleets, both leasing through the Penske Leasing and NFI. And so this project has a lot of cost sharing, and also from getting the ports involved, as well as from the EPA. So a lot of good projects coming here. The next one also had a major press event. The Volvo Lights project is low impact green heavy transportation solutions. Has 15 public and private partners. The first couple of pilot trucks were integrated in North Carolina, delivered to California, and now are in operation. Starting in December 2019, they've been accumulating mileage, about 10,000 miles or more now, serving 2 of the warehouses in our region. There is infrastructure, charging infrastructure at the warehouses and the fleets, and also a couple of public DC fast chargers that are being added. So this has the potential to incorporate learnings, and we're hoping for commercial deployment as early as the end of this year. So a lot of work to be done, a lot of demonstration and data to be collected, but this is a very big project and very promising. So while our end game is zero emissions at the tailpipe, we do also have a lot of engines that are available today, near zero emission trucks. The 9-liter 0.02 gram natural gas engine's been available commercially since 2016 and is being used by many of the major OEMs and in many different applications. So probably the most widely used Class 6 to 8 engine that meets the 0.02 gram NOx standard. Other classes, also the 12-liter, available since 2018, and in a variety, mostly Class 7, 8 applications, as well as, one more. And also continuing to develop engines in other classes, so 7.3-liter, primarily for buses. And also, this slide actually shows the 6.7-liter inline 6. So that one's in the buses too. And this is kind of just a snapshot of some of the projects that we're in development with, but I know you wanted me to focus really on the commercially available products, so that's kind of just a snapshot and overview. But any questions on these more developmental projects? Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious. Now, with the heavy-duty diesel trucks that we have in service now, it's not uncommon at all for some of them to get 1 million miles. Is there any data on electric trucks or zero emission, near zero emission trucks that manufacturers might have? Certainly not you, but.
Yeah, we're really more in the demonstration phase. So development demonstration, we're accumulating mileage, but not really to the level that you're talking about. So, but they can make predictions. So before they're going to commercialize something, they have to understand what kind of warranty they're going to offer, what kind of service is going to be required. So a lot of the data that we're collecting during these demonstrations can help to show that they'll have what the life will be for these new products.
But you don't have any information from the
As
manufacturers
part of this project,
on that.
yeah, we hope to be starting to collect some of this information to make projections.
And Bill, I can expand on that a little bit. This is Naveen again. So the incentive programs, as Lisa indicated, the 8.9 liter engines first started rolling out in late 2015, early 2016. And we've not really had any kind of issue with the engine durability. There's been other complaints about, vehicle issues. The 12-liter engine is the first one was rolled out about 18 months ago, a production commercial product, and we've not received any feedback. The one minor area of concern we heard was specific to one manufacturer, and it didn't have anything to do with the engine or the power plant itself. So Cummins Westport fully warranties these engines, not having seen the long-term durability analysis on these yet, but we did put them through some accelerated testing under the alpha and the beta while the engines were being, or before the certification of the engines actually happened. And it showed very strong performance in terms of grades and reliability and availability equal to today's diesel engines. There were dynamometer and real-life tests, yeah. And then we now are also gathering additional in-use data. So we have the portable emission monitoring systems on there. We're comparing it to chassis dynamometer testing in terms of emissions more so than anything else. But we're continuing to do that assessment. But really, since the 12-liter, you talked about the heavy-duty engine, has been in the market for about 18 months, other than very limited areas that typically are not related to the engine, we've not heard any issues.
Oh, question, yes.
Sorry. Todd Campbell, Clean Energy. By the way, Derek pointed out, thank you for the promotion on the screen. I'm just kidding. But that's actually a yard hostler that's actually operating at the ports and operates on LNG. Wanted to ask about the Daimler project, so the battery electric trucks. Do you know what the range is on those trucks, typically?
Their targeted range is 150, although there are, depending on load and duty cycle, going uphill or down, it could be much greater than that, and they're also, the energy density of batteries is also increasing, so that range would be going up.
Right, but you at 150 or even if 200 miles, you're really looking at a drayage only application at that point. It's not really a long range truck.
That's correct.
So here's where I'm very concerned for us, and I know I'm singing to the choir in the district because we have attainment deadline, that's looming, and the minutes reflected some concern about a federal implementation plan, which I think is a real risk, especially if the current administration continues to stay in office, which is a real possibility, I think. When you look at a $31 million demonstration project that covers 20 trucks, and I understand it also includes infrastructure, if you did the same thing with a low NOx truck, which is pretty much equivalent to a zero emission truck with upstream emissions, given our grid, in terms of carbon emissions, could be better with a low NOx truck if it's powered by renewable natural gas, especially ag, some of the more carbon negative sources, you could get 130 trucks, assuming you put in a $5 million station. I'm mentioning the $5 million station because that's what it costs to put a station in at the division at Metro. So Metro, when they went CNG, they paid about $60 million. With electric, they're going to be paying $1.2 billion, just to kind of give you some perspective. And we know that 2% of our vehicles on our road are 40% of our NOx emissions. They're 25% roughly for our carbon emissions. And UPS has had on order since Tesla and since Nikola announced 200 of each of these trucks, and they have yet to receive order one. So, you know, when Bill Quinn, representing SEEB, last week in Napa at a conference, it was a conference for the California Foundation on Environment and Economy, asked Mary Nichols, you know, why aren't you supporting near zero more? Her response was that we are through Carl Moyer. But you know, and I know, especially at the AQMD, the Carl Moyer is a pretty cumbersome application. You have to have tremendous amount of data, paperwork. You have to prove it out. You have to crush a truck. About 18 months later, because I know you guys are doing a lot of 617 work, that's certainly slowed down, you know, the turnaround time. Then the applicant has 3 months to respond, whether or not they and get a truck on the road to actually, you know, make the program work. And by the way, most of these applicants are probably low-income drivers, not big companies, because those are the ones that have the old trucks. It's pretty hard to actually get something that's cost-effective on the road to reduce emissions that we desperately need, versus a program like the hybrid electric or the heavy-duty bus and truck rule, or program that allows you to go to the dealer, you buy your truck, and you get a voucher, essentially. And that program, ARB is trying to exclusively entertain zero-only applications. And I think that's largely because they went over their skis on the transit bus rule. I bet you in June, you're going to find a lot of transit agencies who are going to really find out what this price tag is, with a governor who's reducing the budget for mobile sources specifically, saying we can't do this. So I just wanted to express a couple of things here that, you know, this week on Tuesday, the Air Resources Board held a workshop on their concept of additional zero-emission fleet regulations. And they have no vision for including near zero whatsoever. Their version of near zero is very different than yours. Your version of near zero includes both hybrid electric, I would imagine, as well as a low NOx truck. They do not include the low NOx truck. They go to great pains to tell you that when they say EV, this is the new narrative. When they say EV, they didn't mean electric vehicle. They mean electric vehicle and fuel cell, okay? Which, if I was representing hydrogen, I'd be insulted. You know, it's not the same. If you want to talk about both technologies, you should just say zero tailpipe. That's what it should be. But if you look at how they're defining near zero, they only include hybrid electric. In other words, they're only advancing the electric side of the equation. They're not accelerating the gaseous side of the equation. And that's a real big problem for us. We have a lot of fleets in the South Coast that are dedicated to gaseous systems. They spent a lot of money. Metro spent a lot of money trying to reduce their emissions. All our transit agencies, our refuse industry, it is substantial. And no one's challenging the Air Resources Board on the total cost of ownership. When you looked at the foothill transit costs under that NREL is doing, it's $7 diesel gallon equivalent versus 2. I mean, they're finding on average it's 6 times more to run an electric versus a diesel. I think that's why Foothill's starting to think maybe electric isn't the answer. Maybe fuel cell is the answer. They're trying to figure out how to make zero work. I hope we do find out how to make zero work. But what I'm really fearful of is that we're running way too fast. And what I was very disappointed in was no one from the AQMD attended that workshop, at least that would represent and say, hey, if we don't reduce emissions now, we are screwed. We are screwed in this basin. And guess what? It falls on all the stationary sources if we can't figure out how to get our mobile source emissions down. So I was very disappointed that AQMD was silent at a workshop that was literally in the auditorium. I thought it was really a missed opportunity. And so I just want to say that I'm hoping that when the AQMD or the Air Resources Board comes back, I think next week for the mobile source strategy, I think it's the 25th, that we have some AQMD representation, because you know what, guys? If we don't have cost-effective ways to address air pollution and everyone's being forced into a square peg, you are going to have people that applied for Carl Moyer that were interested in actually doing something positive saying, you know what? I'm going to sit on my grant. I'm not going to move forward with anything because I have complete uncertainty in my industry. The refuse guys were just going crazy on Tuesday. They couldn't believe it, what they were hearing. They said, we've invested all this money, and you guys are just canceling us out. And yet, on the emissions basis, we're equivalent for all intents and purposes. And ARB staff's response? Well, in 2050, that won't be the case. Well, you know what? I live in 2020. I'm breathing 2020 air. I don't know if I'll be here for 2050 air. But, we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We should be able to invest in zero-emission technology, but also have practical solutions for businesses.
So thank you for that background on ARB and their regulatory strategies. One thing I'd like to add to is we have provided very detailed comments to ARB on their advanced clean truck regulation. One of the points we made is you're concurrently working on your heavy-duty engine standards rule and then working on a clean truck or zero-emission truck rule, if you want to call it. And there's percentages for different size and different times and so on, that really they have to marry those two together somewhere. And that they have to do a regulatory approach to lower those emission standards for heavy-duty engines sooner than later. That's our feedback to them. You're very aware of it. We've been having those conversations probably much more frequently than at a public workshop only. We provided those comments to them repeatedly for their low carbon transportation 3-year fund strategies, where the conversations about cost effectiveness fit in more so. So the South Coast is very actively and closely working with ARB on a lot of different fronts. Staff was in attendance at that meeting. We want to know what changes they're making. As you know, the Advanced Clean Truck Regulation has 2 pathways. One is for fleets, and then one is for manufacturers, and we're continuing to monitor both of those activities very closely. And as I said, we provide written comment letters to them on a regular basis as those proposals shift, and for all of their different regulatory strategies. So I just want to make that clarification. And then also, you talked about different buckets of funds, and I think that's exactly what you see the South Coast doing. We have a bucket of funds for our research and development program, and that's where we're funding the advanced technology like Daimler trucks or Volvo trucks or Peterbilt, or we're working with all the large OEMs, basically. And then we have our incentive funds, and you're correct. Incentive funds come with a lot of guidelines, a lot of requirements, scrapping being one of the key ones, because all of those state incentive funds are designed to get surplus emission reductions above and beyond any other regulatory requirement, and scrapping is a big part of it, but it is difficult. So when they take away funding from HVIP for near zero emission, or that HVIP funding is all tied up even before the board approves the budget for the following year, it leaves us frustrated as well, because we try to leverage those funds wherever possible to accelerate that fleet turnover. So, I can't say I agree with everything that you said, but certainly the South Coast continues to take steps to work with ARB in the most cost-effective pathways forward, as well as on the longer-term programs for zero-emission technology that eventually will be technology ready to deploy. And this is the other part of it. Hopefully, there will be sufficient funds available for the deployment of those zero emission technologies.
Yeah. Well, let me clarify my statement by saying, Wayne, Matt, you have been wonderful at the dais and podium advocating up in Sacramento. I guess what I worry about is when Tony Brazil comes in and says the cost of electricity is between 12 cents to 26 cents maximum for a kilowatt hour, and NNREL showing $7 in your house. You need to slam them down and get the reality there. You can't let them express total mistruths and force everybody into something that won't happen. We don't have the time. I mean, we do not have the time. We are going to get a FIP. There's no doubt in my mind. And everybody wants to say it's not going to happen. It's happened. It's happened in Sacramento. It's happened in Texas. It can happen.
Yeah. So just on the electricity costing, and I'm not going to get into a back and forth because we have the next agenda item. But certainly they clearly laid out their assumptions of nighttime charging when those fleets are capable of doing it. So they set it up in a manner where they were looking at a snapshot of a particular fleet that could take that approach. But clearly, many workshop attendees made the comment that that's not available for all the fleets out there, and we recognize that. But again, that element needs to go into their cost-effectiveness analysis, and that's certainly something that we'll be providing comments on.
Todd, doesn't this go back to having people measure the cost and the results? And that, I know that everybody's tired of me saying that for the last 5 years, but until the district and CARB and us on the private side measure what our costs are and then measure the results, we're going to be in deep doo-doo.
Big time.
I mean, and we're going to be chasing people that provide jobs out of this state.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, the budget, we've set aside $1 billion for climate. That will even cover one transit authority in the state of California.
Hold on. Harvey, go ahead. Okay, go ahead over there.
Okay. The history of CARB. Hello, this is Harvey Etter for myself and Public Solar Power Coalition. History, 15, 20 years ago, they had the zero emissions program. 10% of all manufactured vehicles in California were going to be zero emission vehicles by law. All right? That's where we were 15, 20 years ago. You've heard of who killed the electric car? If you haven't, look it up. And it's all about this in the organization that, was using these vehicles and stuff and trying to get, grassroots people and putting in solar and whatnot. It was shot down. It went on for several years. But we got 500,000, 1 million cars sold in the state? That would be 50,000, 100,000 additional. This is going back 15, 20 years. So those numbers would be way up. And we're not looking at drug-resistant antibiotics, antifungals being put in through the waste system for renewable natural gas. It's taking away money from solar for the low-cost fuel, LCFS, low-cost fuel standards, low-carbon fuel standards. Where the market for cap and trade is $10, $20 a ton, it's $100, $200 a ton. They're making out like bandits. That's what's going on over here. Versus solar electric vehicles, solar, electric, hydrogen, and other models that are available. So there's a terrible history to this with CARB and the state, and it's garbage. This image of California being the big leader in climate and stuff. With Jerry Brown under 350 was supposed to negotiate the transition. He comes from oil and gas. He didn't. He's supposed to job. He didn't do nothing. That's history too. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point now. Maybe other points later in comments. Thank you.
Any other comments on this end? Don't see any. I think. Oh, go ahead, Todd.
I'll be brief. Under the low carbon fuel standard, renewable natural gas is the lowest carbon fuel. And if you put it towards electricity, the carbon benefits go from a natural gas engine from a dairy could be up to 380, negative 380 carbon intensity. If you put it towards electric, it's about negative 600 to 700 carbon intensity. So actually, it's incredible, especially when it goes into electric applications. So on that front, I'd say, the climate, the short-term climate plan for our state is a third of our strategy to reach climate. In fact, Lawrence Livermore National Labs came out with a report a month ago that said we need to do carbon negative fuels, otherwise we'll never reach carbon neutrality. So it's science. It could be used for not just natural gas vehicles. It could be used for electric vehicles. It could be used for fuel cell vehicles. And I think Harvey makes a good point. We've been trying to do light duty vehicles since the 1980s in the electric space. I actually think it's a pretty good application. We're trying to ram it down the heavy duty space, and we do not know what we're doing.
I want to respond. I'd like to respond to that. Okay, first of all, these numbers are jacked around. Rather than flaring, they take emitting it right into the atmosphere. That's garbage. So these numbers are wrong. Okay. Santa Monica, California, 200 buses out of a landfill in Texas, waste. They put it in a natural gas pipeline, and it spread, whatever's there, all over the place. We've never looked at this. They didn't have to report the deaths from antifungals, antibiotics, and whatnot until about a year and a half ago in the state of California. Natural gas is a problem. The real numbers, the district used to use 20 global warming potential compared to carbon dioxide. The real numbers in AR5 IPCC is 86. Also, they have radiative forcing. That number, instead of 0.48, has gone up to 0.6 or 0.61, 27% increase. And it's against the law to import natural gas into the state. 95% of natural gas comes into the state. 98% of it's fracked. Fracking numbers, 10 years ago at Cornell, Howarth, said the number compared based on 20
Harvey
is at 105. So that's five times the other numbers multiplied, and you've got like
Harvey, you're 3 minutes for this item, so we're going to we need to move on to the next
700 times, and this is the sixth great extinction. Those happen from volcanic eruptions and stuff. This is
Harvey?
From fossil fuels and from us, and it's insane to do this again. 150
years
ago, we
Harvey.
were
You're
charging the fuels.
Item. We're going to move on to the next item.
I can test whether this is my time or not.
Unless there's any other board member comments that would need to be raised on this last item. If not, we can move on to the next item.
None over here.
Board members, any other board member comments?
None over here. None over here.
Okay. All right. Sarah Reese, please go ahead and get us our update on the 2016 AQMP.
Sure. So my name is Sarah Reese. I'm an Assistant Deputy Executive Officer in Planning at the district. I want to give you an update on where we are on implementation for our 2016 AQMP. We're just kicking off the process on our 2022 AQMP, and then also talk about the contingency measure for the 2016 AQMP that we recently submitted. I do have a bunch of materials. I will try to be expeditious as I go through this presentation, but certainly happy to stop and answer any questions you have on the way. So just skipping ahead real quick. So just a background on our air quality management plan. I mean, this is the blueprint that we put together every so often to show the federal government how we're going to meet state and federal air quality standards. We developed this through a very public process. So for our last AQMP, it was a 3-year development. Many white papers were developed. There was an AQMP advisory group that helped provide us input as we developed the plan. We had multiple workshops in the region, many stakeholder meetings to get input. This plan was approved by our governing board back in March of 2017, and it really is an integrated plan. So it addresses multiple national ambient air quality standards. You can see some of them listed in the table there. So there's both multiple ozone standards and PM standards. So this plan basically outlines how we're going to meet those by the applicable dates. And then again, a refresher for us. Our big challenge is really meeting the ozone standard. We are an extreme non-attainment area for ozone. We have the worst ozone in the country. NOx is the key pollutant of concern that we need to reduce in order to meet the ozone standards, and we need a fairly dramatic reduction. So 45% reduction in NOx emissions by 2023, 55% reduction in 2031. Most of our NOx emissions are coming from mobile sources, and so that's why we've been focused very heavily on getting emission reductions from that sector. We likely could shut down all of the stationary sources in our district and still fail to attain the ozone standards just because of the dominance of NOx coming from mobile sources. So in our AQMP, for the 2016 AQMP, there were a couple of elements here. I mentioned that there's multiple standards both for ozone and for PM 2.5. We've submitted these to EPA. EPA has approved our plan for 2016. Most of these elements have been approved. One thing I do want to point out is that for the 1997 8-hour standard, there was a contingency measure requirement in there, and that's something that they approved our plan based, contingent basically on approving that contingency measure. And so that's something that we have developed over the past year. We submitted that to EPA in December of this year, and I'm going to talk more in detail about that at the end of the presentation. In terms of implementation of our 2016 AQMP, we detail a bunch of measures that we were going to develop either through rules or through other measures that we're going to get emission reductions. And these can be, we are focused on NOx because that is the primary pollutant of concern to meet the ozone standard, but we're also looking at other substances too. So we're concerned about air toxics. We understand that there's health impacts associated with those. So you are going to see some rules, and we do have some on, metal finishing, metal plating, focused primarily at getting emission reductions on air toxics, but then also some of the NOx rules. So this is just a listing of some of the rules that we have developed to date. We also have some here. This is mostly focused on NOx emission reductions. This is our transition from the reclaim program and putting rules in effect to address that and to get us even further emission reductions of NOx. And then coming up in 2020, we can see we have a whole slew of regulations, both for NOx emission reductions as well for air toxics, where we'll be continuing to implement what we said we were going to do in the 2016 AQMP and then be able to capture the emission reductions from that. Again, with our focus on NOx, a big chunk of what we're doing is looking at facility-based mobile source measures. And so these are measures addressed at indirect sources of emissions. These are indirect sources or facilities that by themselves don't really emit a lot of emissions, but they attract a whole bunch of mobile sources to the facilities, and those mobile sources have a ton of emissions associated with them. So these are things like airports, ports, rail yards. Those are all very classic examples of facility-based measures. We have 5 identified. For the airports, we've just recently completed an MOU process with them, where each of the 5 major airports in our district completed a clean air action plan, and then we had signed an MOU with us to develop elements of that clean air action plan and to get emission reductions. We're working with our San Pedro ports right now to also along the lines of developing an MOU. This is building upon the work that the ports did on their clean air action plan and taking specific elements, namely their focus on their clean truck program, and incorporating that into an MOU and having some commitments from the ports on implementing that. We're also working on warehouses and rail yards. For those facility-based measures, we're working on indirect source rules, so using our special authority under the Clean Air Act to do a regulation for that. Those are in development right now. We hope to come to our board with a warehouse rule later this spring, and then by the end of the year for a rule on rail yards. And then on new and redevelopment, we're still working with our stakeholders, investigating what rule concepts would be. This would be for like new construction projects or redevelopment for of projects in the district. But we still, our guidance from our board was to evaluate what potential economic impacts would be from that. And so we're still thinking about that and what that might look like in terms of a recommendation. And then another element of our 2016 AQMP was looking at our incentive programs. So we had some funds that we were able to disperse to get emission reduction or technology demonstration projects, both on mobile sources and then also with stationary sources. And we're in the middle of deploying these right now. We hope if we're successful with all of this, we'll get an additional 88 tons per year of NOx reduction, as well as some PM 2.5 reductions as well. And then CARB also has a chunk of a commitment for our 2016 AQMP. So there are some various strategies that CARB committed to implement and develop. They're in the process of doing that, but that also accounted for some of the commitment that we made to EPA. So that's effectively where we are in terms of the 2016 AQMP. I'm going to talk at the end about where we are on the contingency measure, because that's like the sort of the real big chunk that's missing and sort of the linchpin that everything is resting on. I'll talk real brief about where we are on the 2022 AQMP, because we always have new standards we have to meet and show the federal government what we're doing. So first, here's some of the obligations that we're looking at through 2022. Two standards that we're really looking at for a 1997 ozone standard. The Coachella Valley, that area used to be classified as severe non-attainment. Over the summer, we knew that we weren't going to meet the attainment date for that area, and so we used the latitude that's provided to us under the Clean Air Act to bump that area up into extreme non-attainment. That gave us an additional 5 years to attain the standard. We believe we're going to be able to attain the standard in Coachella by that time. There'll be other regulations that are in effect that will help that area meet the standard. But we do have an obligation to submit some things to EPA. So we have to submit a SIP in February 14th, 2021. And then for the 2015 standard, which is what our 2022 AQMP is squarely focused on, both for South Coast and for Coachella Valley basins, we have some obligations where we have to submit some materials to EPA. Notably, the bulk of that is due August 3rd, 2022. And so that's really what our AQMP in 2022 is going to focus on. We are very much in the early process of this. We have initiated an AQMP advisory group and have had a couple of meetings of that. But really want to work with folks to get input both on the different SIP elements that we're going to be submitting over the next few years, as well as what this 2022 AQMP looks like. But it's really squarely focused at addressing the 2015 8-hour ozone standard, both in South Coast and Coachella. And then on our 2023 attainment deadline, what progress we made of that? That's a contingency measure that I mentioned before. We did discuss that we were extreme non-attainment area for South Coast. We have an attainment deadline coming up June 15th, 2024. We did rely on black box provisions. So this is a section under the Clean Air Act that's only allowed for extreme non-attainment areas. And it says that because you have like 20 years to be able to show that you're going to attain those areas, you know the technology is going to advance over time. And so the Clean Air Act says, okay, you might not have to identify those technologies right now because 20 years is a lot of time and there's a lot of things that will develop. So you can point to development of new technologies as a way in which you're going to attain. But when you do that, then you have an obligation to tell EPA 3 years before that attainment deadline what exactly that looks like. You can't just say, point to a black box forever. And so this is what this contingency measure is. It's really being more specific about what those technologies are, what those steps are to be able to show EPA how we're going to attain the standard. We do have a good news story. We've made a lot of progress since 1997. So you can see in our 1997 baseline, we were at over 1,100 tons per day of NOx. That's come down dramatically, and that's through a lot of hard work and dedication by folks here, and also working with all of you guys. So in 2012, that baseline was down by over a half, down to 524 tons per day. But unfortunately, in 2023, our carrying capacity, which is the amount of NOx we think we can have in the atmosphere and still meet the standard, that's at 141 tons per day. So we still have that piece of the column in red, that 128 tons per day. That's still the amount that we have to reduce in order to meet the standard in 2023. It's still a significant chunk. In terms of our strategy for meeting NOx, I mentioned we have the baseline in 2023 is 269 tons. We've got to get down to that 141 ton per day for our carrying capacity. So we have 27 tons of defined measures, both from our district as well as from stationary sources and mobile sources. And then CARB also has some defined measures that we rely on. So you add those up, you get to the 27 tons, but that still allows for 108 tons on this further deployment of cleaner technologies, this black box provision. So it's still a very significant chunk that we have to show, how we're going to fill those 108 tons, where that comes from. Now, in our 2016 AQMP, when we talked about this black box and relied on it, we did actually put some detail in there. So we split out where we thought we were going to get these emission reductions. So, a big chunk from on-road heavy-duty diesel, from ocean-going vessels, off-road equipment, and then to some extent smaller chunks from on-road light-duty, from locomotives, and from aircraft. Yes?
So where you're on ocean-going vessels, what percentage, in your opinion, of ocean-going vessels will impact or influence your plan here? Is it a small amount?
It's actually a fairly significant chunk. Right now, of our NOx emissions in the basin, heavy-duty trucks are the biggest source, but by 2023, we expect that ocean-going vessels are actually going to be the single biggest source of NOx in our basin. And that's because we get, we have a very busy port complex, so a lot of boats visit us. Even though we're in what's called an emission control area for ocean-going vessels, which requires low NOx vessels, there's a lot of loopholes in that. And so we still get a lot of pretty old vessels calling at our ports. They don't have the cleanest technology, and so there's a lot of NOx emissions associated with them still. So the different elements of our contingency measure plan. First thing, look at if there's additional emission reduction strategies that we could identify and show to EPA. Then look if there's additional pots of incentive funding. As you guys are aware, we've been very successful with our incentive programs and being able to use that to turn over mobile source fleets and get cleaner engines and cleaner vehicles in the fleets. And then finally, we want to talk about this federal measures and responsibilities. And that's an important element because as a local air district, we have limited authority over a lot of these sources. Even CARB has limited authority over some of these sources. And so we need to start turning the conversation to what the federal government needs to do. So in terms of our identified emission reduction strategies, we were able to go through and we were identified 24 to 26 tons per day of NOx emissions from a variety of different areas we were able to look at. So that's good, but still, you might remember we need to get to the 108 tons per day, so that's not all the way we need to go, but we're still getting a good chunk of NOx emission reductions from these additional strategies. And then CARB has what they call their innovative new measures. So we think we'll get a 3 ton per day emission reduction off that. So there's a variety of measures they have in place for that. Things like a Tier 5 off-road diesel engine standard, so just a new standard for those off-road engines. Their state green contracting program where they would get cleaner and newer engines used for state projects. Looking at some locomotive emission reduction measures. Through all of those, they think they're going to be able to get some additional reductions. Incentive funding is really important. As I mentioned, we've been pretty successful. Rita?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Can you speak a little bit more about the regional VMT reductions on the previous slide and how those would play out?
Yeah, so CARB has some, some strategies looking at VMT reduction. If you have less vehicle miles traveled, that, we would expect that be some co-benefit of NOx emission reductions associated with that. It's going to be a relatively small amount, but that's, one strategy that CARB is working at with also with the regional transportation authorities.
So, Sarah, I have a question on your slide 17 about contingency measures and for reductions 3 years prior to 2023. That's like right now.
Yes.
How optimistic are you that EPA is going to approve those?
So we've worked very hard with EPA to show, and if I get through the presentation, you'll see what the totality of this contingency measure plan looks like. EPA has 6 months from time of submittal to issue what they call a completeness determination. So say that, yes, you've submitted all the required elements. If they don't act by that 6 months, then it becomes complete as an operation of law, and then they have some time by which, some clocks by which they can take action to either approve, partially approve, disapprove, etc. But effectively, we have between now and an 18-month window by which EPA could take action, and then if they are disapproving or only partially approving, there could be some sanction clocks associated with that.
Will a sanction clock start then at the end of the 18 months?
The sanction clock starts after EPA takes action. So if it's anything less than a full approval, there could be some form of a sanction clock started at that point.
So that could be within the next 6 months then?
That could be within the next 6 months if EPA takes action very quickly, which they could theoretically do. So I'll just go back to where are we? Incentives. So we have identified some additional pots of money that we can access to get emission reductions, so approximately $800 million over a 4-year period. But if you think back to our 2016 AQMP, we'd identified that we needed about $1 billion per year over a 14-year period to be able to meet the 2023 attainment date. So that's short of what we need. It's we'll take it, but it's still short of what we need. And so we know we need additional funding, and we're taking whatever action we can to try to secure that. We have our voting district authorization legislation, which, if we're successful, we believe could bring us something in the realm of $1.4 billion per year. Also looking at other mechanisms, that might not be successful, so we have to keep trying and see what we can do. If we are successful with the voter district authorization legislation and that is successful on the ballot, we expect in 2023 we could get about 15 ton per day of NOx emission reductions. So this chart shows different sectors of NOx emissions from from vehicles, from basically all the major sectors that contribute NOx. And what's the important takeaway for this chart, as you can see, for the sectors that are subject mostly to CARB or South Coast Authority, you can see where they've been going down over time. So, for example, the green line, that's heavy-duty vehicles and buses. Since 2007, those emissions have come down pretty dramatically. We've on light and medium-duty vehicles, we've seen some very dramatic emission reductions. But notably, you look at the bottom line, that red line, and that has a little EPA symbol next to it. Those are our federal sources. So those are aircraft, ocean-going vessels, locomotives. That line has stayed stagnant. That line's actually gone up a little bit over time. And that's because EPA regulations really haven't kept pace with what we need in the district, and in fact, in many cases, haven't kept pace at all. It's been a very delayed action in terms of EPA reviewing emission standards for these sources and taking action. And then when you look at the overall contribution of those federal sources, it's 36%. It's a big chunk of those emissions that we need that are going to be affecting us in 2023. So it's a fairly large portion of emissions that we effectively have very limited control over and a limited ability to be able to regulate. So we've identified some measures that we think the federal government could take and what those emission reductions would look like if the federal government were to take that action. Recognizing that 2023 is coming up very quickly, so that doesn't give a lot of time, These could be either through regulatory actions. The federal government could also develop incentive programs and find funds to incentivize fleet turnover as well. So in going through that, we think on the heavy-duty vehicle sector, repowering those engines with low NOx engines in 2023 can get up to 35 tons per day of NOx reductions. On ocean-going vessels, ensuring that the cleanest NOx emission vessels come to California ports, that can get us up to 28 tons per day. And so when we go down the list like that, we think that the federal government, there could be up to 78 ton per day of emission reductions in 2023 by taking those actions. So when they're adding up all of what I've talked about, 24 to 26 additional emission reductions from identified reduction strategies, both at South Coast and by CARB. Looking at our additional incentive funding, if we're successful for that, that would be 15 tons per day. And then we think 67 to 69 tons per day from additional federal measures, either through their regulatory actions or from additional funding. Adding that up, that gets us to the 108 tons per day. So, bottom line, we do have a success story in which we've made very significant emission reductions over time, but we have a very steep challenge here in Southern California in order to meet the ozone standard. We've done all we can with our existing authority, with existing funding, but we still have more than we need to do. And it really takes all levels of government to be able to address and tackle this problem. We know we need more incentive funding, and we're going to continue to push for that so that we can continue to turn over the fleets. And then at the end of the day, we are going to need federal action to help us with some of these very significant emission source categories that are subject to federal control. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Sarah, thanks for the very nice, concise overview. It was very, very good. My question really is, at least I could comment on your call to action, is I think everyone here, all stationary sources, would agree you've done everything you possibly can. There's nothing more you could do within your control, regulatory control, to get to attainment. EPA hasn't stepped up with the on-road heavy-duty standard you need to get to attainment. CARB is focused on electrification, which frankly slows down our progress. So my point really is, if we don't attain, I think it's going to be when there's penalties, when Section 185 gets triggered, whether stationary sources are in the crosshairs of paying the penalty, how can we avoid that or shift the paradigm, say, we're not responsible, it's these other entities, and think ahead. Last time Bill Lamar and I were trying to find some way to, not be penalized, went to Washington, D.C. with Barry Wallerston, and he would tell legislators, no matter what we could do, shut down all stationary sources, it wouldn't matter. So I'd like that dialogue started up earlier, so if that does happen, when it does happen, we have some way to keep the stationary sources from paying the penalty.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I will say that I feel that we are in a little bit of uncharted territory in terms of being an area that is at the, hasn't really triggered some of these actions in the Clean Air Act. And these were provisions of the act that were written over 40 years ago. Nobody ever really thought these days would come to pass. I will say, likely in a different administration, EPA would probably sit down with us and try to work out what would be a reasonable approach forward. It's a little unclear where that's going to fall today, but we continue to work with Region 9 and also in DC to alert folks of the issues that we face and help them understand, what the nature is and what we can do and what would make sense given everything that we face.
But we've in the past we've been hearing terms like all reasonable measures and reasonable further progress and so on. You've got a building full of PhDs, and you go to great lengths on building a case for each one every time we come up against something like this. It would seem to me that you could make an obviously reasonable case that we have done everything here with the sources under your jurisdiction. And no matter what we do, I think as either you or somebody said earlier, we could turn everything, shut off all businesses, and we still wouldn't reach attainment. So I guess when you're saying sit down and negotiate or talk this over with EPA, then we get another 20 years or something like this, and we're just really kicking the can down the road again.
Yeah, I mean, part of the difficulty, and I mentioned that we're in a bit of an uncharted territory with this, is that the Clean Air Act actually has some hard teeth in it at the end, right? So I'm like, the whole scheme is that if when you're in ozone non-attainment, there's multiple levels of it, and you start off at maybe at a very low level of attainment, but if you keep going on with time and you're unable to attain those levels, or if you start off like we did, always pretty far out of attainment, they give you a long time. The Clean Air Act never anticipated that 20 years would not be enough to attain. And so, and the Clean Air Act also didn't anticipate that I think that you would be in the situation where there's actually not very much from a regulatory perspective that the entity that has the responsibility of meeting those standards could do to be able to make it. It's all very much focused on, you put the regulations in place, you take those actions, and it all magically works out. So I think that's where our conundrum is that we were faced with statutory provisions that have very hard deadlines and consequences associated with them, with perhaps a reality that doesn't really conform to that or make much sense.
Well, in the trip that David alluded to a little while ago back to Washington, one of the many lawmakers we met was Henry Waxman, and one of his opening lines I'll never forget, and I think David won't either, is that I understand my bill has had some unintended consequences. He recognized it. Of course, he was referring to Section 185, where we would have to pay not for being out of compliance, but for the region being out of attainment. So, I mean, if he and other lawmakers like him can see that, I think there's certainly an undercurrent that bodes for at least them listening.
So I think what you said, David, about you can definitely make a logical case. The question is whether you can make a legal case, and the act is pretty difficult to slide through at this point. But what Sarah was saying is, with a cooperative administration, you would find a way to work through it. With this administration, it's not just not being able to work through it; they will use it against California. So we do go to D.C. We've been, how many trips since you guys went years ago? Dozens and dozens of trips, and we say the same thing that we can't do it alone. We only, we don't have the authority to tackle the mobile sources and the federal sources. It's the same message, but we're just not confident that things are working the way that they used to, where you would work through some of these sticky Clean Air Act issues. And I think if you think you're going to get a Clean Air Act amendment to help California out of Congress, I think you're sadly mistaken.
Quote Henry Waxman when we asked exactly that years ago. What was his quote? Anytime you'd open the Clean Air Act, there'd be a gnashing of the teeth, something to that effect. So even at that friendly time, no one is willing to do it. Certainly they're not going to do it now, but we still have the dilemma of unintended consequences coming down on stationary sources. So to the extent we could work with San Joaquin or other air districts to find some creative ways to focus our attention on the problem rather than the unintended consequences, we're happy to help.
You mentioned the PhDs, but our legal staff is also looking at all the options right now. And I do want to say, while we worked through the Section 185 problem for the 1 hour standard and we're able to find a pathway where our stationary sources weren't burdened, I'm not sure we'll be able to do that this time, because that was excess emission reductions we were getting from our incentive programs that were used in place of those fees, and now we're taking full credit for all those incentive programs. So the two main thing on stationary sources is those 185 fees and your offset ratio going to 2 to 1, and those two things could be very hard to avoid.
And just to get the dialogue, I appreciate the dialogue, but where I'm going with this is, before it becomes a problem, if we could think of ways to move forward and us help you out, or however we could do that. I'd hate to just be scrambling around to try to find a solution later.
Well, the AQMP, 2022 AQMP is ramping up. That's a forum where this will all get discussed as things move forward, and updates from the last submittal and all our interim submittals. And, obviously if somebody has creative ideas on how to deal with this, they should be talking to us.
Solar energy.
There's one. But yeah, I mean, we're open to solving this dilemma.
Rita, go ahead.
Question, Sarah. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that you needed 128 tons per day of NOx reduction to meet the attainment. I think there was a number of 128.
Yeah, that is the number. I'm trying to find the slide.
Okay, and then the other slide, you have all the strategies that you're thinking to implement under the contingency measure plan would give you 108. So there's about a 20-ton per day differential. Can you explain that a little bit more and where the other
Let me go
20
back.
tons?
So the 108 that was in our further deployment measures. So that's the black box provision. We have 27 defined tons per day of defined measures on top of that. So when you add it up, and there's some accounting changes in there, so there's a few tons here and there off for different accounting methodologies, but it does add up. So, but the 108, that's the focus of the black box. So those are the pieces that we have to explain in our contingency measure plan how we're going to fill.
Any other questions? Hold on, Harvey. You have to do a public comment card. There's one right there. There's
okay. No individual item. You're taking away my rights.
Harvey, you can do public comment, okay?
What's the numbers on the trucks?
Any other questions from the committee members? There's none over here, Mayor.
Yep, I hear you. If there's no other comments, there's the written reports that are attached. Does anyone have any other business besides public comment?
One question. Do we have a policy for this group as far as public comment? Is that the same as what we've had before? It seems like we have a rather unique situation here, and it'd be nice to just know what the ground rules are.
This is a Brown Act meeting, so it's not really a unique situation, and we do provide for public comment. It can be limited by the chair as needed.
And with that, Harvey, would you go ahead and give us your 3 minutes of public comment at that point in the meeting?
Use mine.
Hello, my name's Harvey Etter. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition. We got run out of federal court, a 9th appellate court below the Supreme Court, December 2nd. We were not allowed to file our legal papers and to petition the government, including you folks, the state and the feds. We didn't get our day in court. We didn't get a right to appeal. We didn't get a right to file papers to contest this, okay? You folks purged the Solar New Deal and the 16 plan, over 100 exhibits. None of it was analyzed, okay? The Department of Energy's done this for the last 10 years. Solar's cost effective. The Sunshot program, based on the moonshot from the 60s. Okay, it works. It's here now. Now, this garbage about demonstrations from EPA and not doing control technology guidelines or alternate control technologies for 20, 30, 40 years, purging, never analyzing solar.
2 minutes.
Okay, what DOE has already done for demonstrations has to be grandfathered in and accepted for all demonstrations, for all technologies. It's cost effective now and has to be utilized. And, okay, we filed with the FIP in 89, the 91 plan we filed in 92, and including in that was that this is premature death. You know how many deaths you're going to have, like 5,000 a year in the district, and with climate you can make that 1,000 times more. Okay, this is murder. Okay, we filed also under RICO. We were dismissed without prejudice. It's still good and you guys were served, and it has to do with the FIP coming up here, okay? This stuff was not analyzed. We put all these cases in there, 5,000 from appellate court, and what happened back in 12. It's garbage. It's outrageous. And that the district and you folks are not settling. Okay, now there are plans. There's 20-year plans. There's SCAG. There's LA City. They've got 40-year plans all over the city. Okay, they've got a Green New Deal. It's past policy. That is the city of LA. That's 10%, 5% of the district, 3-4 million people. That has to be coordinated with the Green New Deal and the New Deal for the city, and whatever comes out of Bernie and Biden and Warren and folks. Okay, this is real stuff. It's all in politics. March 3rd, this stuff is being dealt now. I'm incorporating by reference the New York Times Magazine, August 1/18 by Nathaniel Rich, Losing Earth, Why We Had a Chance from 79 to 89 of dealing with climate change before the oil companies went into their denial thing.
All right, Harvey, your 3 minutes are expired. Thank you very much for your comments.
Outrageous, and it's capitalism, not climate.
Our next
not
meeting,
human nature.
excuse me, our next meeting will be March 13th. Back in this room again in GB, and thank you all for coming, and hope to see you there. And happy Valentine's Day to everybody.
Likewise.